In this section of chapter 26, we're going to take a look at how life evolved from simple unicellular organisms to complex multicellular organisms. The earliest evidence of life on this planet dates back nearly 3.5 billion years ago and can be found in rock-like aggregations known as stromatolites. These rock-like features seem to have been created by ancient ancestors of the cyanobacteria, which, if you may remember, are the closest living relatives to the modern chloroplast. Cyanobacteria tend to live in mats on the sea floor, where they tend to absorb minerals from the seawater. This causes the mat of cyanobacteria to lithify or turn to stone. This actually kills the cyanobacteria, whereupon a new colony will start to form on top. So over time, progressively more and more layers of lithified cyanobacterial colonies will accumulate. And this can be seen in cross-section of a stromatolite. When we look closely at these stromatolite sections, what we tend to find are microfossils of ancient cyanobacteria dating back roughly 3.5 billion years. These are the oldest known fossils on the planet. Judging from the complexity of these cyanobacterial fossils found in stromatolites, we can safely assume that life must have evolved much earlier than 3.5 billion years ago. Most likely, the first life forms may have evolved as early as 3.9 billion years ago. And based on the conditions of the early Earth at that time, we can also safely assume that these first life forms were anaerobes due to the lack of oxygen in the atmosphere. They were, of course, prokaryotic, and they were heterotrophs. They evolved before photosynthesis. So it's very important to remember, and we must stress, that the first organisms on this planet were anaerobic, prokaryotic heterotrophs. And these life forms dominated the planet for roughly 2 billion years. The first forms of photosynthesis to appear on this planet were regarded as being anoxygenic because of the fact that water was not split for a source of electrons during this process, and therefore oxygen was not produced as a byproduct. Now, somewhere around 3.5 billion years ago, other forms of photosynthesis started to evolve. Oxygenic photosynthesis, as the name suggests, involves the splitting of water and the release of oxygen as a byproduct. This process most likely coincided with the appearance of ancient cyanobacteria around 3.5 billion years ago. And as a result of this process, it initiated what is often regarded as the oxygen revolution during this early part of Earth's history. During the so-called oxygen revolution, oxygen first begins to concentrate in the oceans. And it's only when the oceans become fully saturated with oxygen that it starts to become concentrated in the atmosphere and establishes the oxidizing atmosphere that we have today. The oxygen revolution spelled doom for a lot of prokaryotes living at this point in Earth's history. For the most part, they were unable to process a lot of the byproducts associated with the metabolism of oxygen. There were some groups of prokaryotes, however, that were able to tolerate the presence of oxygen because they had enzymes that enabled them to break down some of these otherwise harmful byproducts. Anaerobic prokaryotes did survive, at least some of them, in environments that remained strictly anaerobic. About 2 billion years ago, the first eukaryotic cells appeared, most likely from certain prokaryotes that acquired an internal membrane system from the infoldings of the outer plasma membrane. These infoldings would most likely give rise to what is now known as the endomembrane system. In addition, these early eukaryotes also established symbiotic relationships with certain prokaryotic cells. The presence of an endomembrane system plus these prokaryotic symbionts enabled these early eukaryotic cells to establish a much more complex, diverse metabolism. The existence of certain proteins within the plasma membrane of early eukaryotic cells may have enabled them to bind together to give rise to the first multicellular organisms. As we will see, the selective pressure initiating the organization of free-living unicellular eukaryotes into multicellular complexes may have been predation. In this investigation, a unicellular green algae is subjected to the presence of a predatory species, after which these formerly free-living cells associate into a large multicellular complex too large to be consumed by the predatory species. It's important to remember that without the presence of these binding proteins in the plasma membrane of these algal cells, they would not be able to associate into these large multicellular complexes even in the presence of a predatory species. One of the earliest multicellular organisms that evolved in the manner that I previously described are choanoflagellates. Choanoflagellates may be unicellular, as seen here, or they may be colonial. They are all aquatic filter feeders. As can be seen in this colonial species, it consists of a single stalk around which various cells are radially arranged. These choanoflagellates have been identified as the closest living relatives of animals based on several lines of evidence. As can be seen, choanoflagellates and animals share many DNA sequences in common, particularly those sequences that code for proteins involved in the binding of cells. These are the proteins that make multicellularity possible. In addition, the cells that comprise choanoflagellates are very, very similar in structure and function to those found in other animal groups. These lines of evidence suggest that animals and choanoflagellates share a common ancestor in the distant past. As we can see in this geologic timescale, for much of Earth's history, during a period known as the Precambrian, the fossil record is very, very poor. It's only with the evolution of hard parts, such as shells and bones and teeth, do species begin to become more diverse and more evident in the fossil record. 500 million years ago, in what is now known as the Cambrian Period, most all of the major groups of eukaryotes appear in the fossil record. And it's during this time that plants, animals, as well as fungi begin to colonize the land. During the so-called Cambrian explosion, whereby life begins to colonize terrestrial environments, it is the plants and the fungi that invade land first, and they create hospitable environments for the potential colonization of other organisms. Herbivores soon follow, and their predators. In future chapters, we will consider many of the crucial adaptations exhibited by these organisms for survival and reproductive success on land.